Welcome, everyone. We're really excited for today's session, and where we're going to be talking about establishing um, uh, digital pathology networks for patient care. And we have with us today a real pioneer in the field, especially a Canadian pioneer here, Dr. Evans. So Dr. Evans is the Chief Pathology and Medical Director of Laboratory Medicine at Mackenzie Health, and he is the Associate Professor at the University of Toronto and internationally recognized expert in digital pathology with over 20 years of experience in the use of technology for patient care purposes. Mackenzie Health transitioned to complete digital pathology for surgical pathology in 2021 and is currently in the process of integrating AI tools into routine diagnostic routine diagnostic workflow. Prior to moving to Mackenzie Health in 2020, Dr. Evans was director of telepathology, in digital pathology at the University of Health Network, or UHN, from the inception of the program in 2004. The program successfully introduced digital pathology into routine patient care for frozen sections, consultation, quality patient care for frozen quality control assurance, and primary diagnoses. I'll just give it over to you, Dr. Evans. And the last slide I had to share was just encourage everyone on the call. We have a chat area, so please submit your Q&A, and then towards the end, we'll see if we have some time to have Dr. Evans answer any of the questions. And so with that said, Dr. Evans, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's get my first slide up there. Thanks very much, Jason, for inviting me to speak. And I just caught a glimpse of who's on the call, and there are some familiar faces, familiar names there. So what I was going to discuss was just my own personal experience in establishing digital pathology networks for patient care, highlighting some obvious drivers, promises, but most importantly, indicating some of the pain points and identifying what I think are some of the key solutions going forward. Establishing digital pathology networks, if I had a subtitle, it would be this: fabulous and necessary idea, easier said than done. Speaker disclosures, I think first and foremost, I usually start out all of my presentations with this comment that the content of the presentation reflects my personal experience with implementing digital pathology systems in a variety of practice settings, starting in 2004 right up to the present time. I have received honoraria for various advisory boards, panel discussions, etc., none of which have any bearing on the presentation that I'll give now. Learning objectives. So I thought I would give you an overview of implementing digital pathology in academic versus community practice settings from my own personal perspective. And so these are really the local implementations, which are really the starting point for building a network. You can't do it unless you have local implementations. Go through the value proposition for establishing digital pathology links between local implementations, the challenges that can be encountered, and I think I would underscore here that patience is indeed a virtue. There really are no shortcuts. You can't, and this is a process that really shouldn't be rushed. You really have to proceed with caution and prudence. And I'll highlight this from my personal experience with 3 different projects. And then moving forward, just a little bit on standards and interoperability. I mean, this last point can be probably a whole 2-hour presentation, but I simply don't have time to get into too much on that. But I will leave you with my thoughts on the way forward. In terms of value proposition, I mean, we've long been experiencing a growing emphasis and indeed a public expectation on improving quality in pathology by creating healthcare networks or seamless access to care providers that may be located in different institutions. And digital pathology networks will enable enhanced access to subspecialty expertise. They support underserviced or remote regions where there can be issues, even in terms of recruiting and retaining local surgeons if there isn't an on-site pathologist. Not to mention workload leveling across sites. It goes without saying that digital path will enable a decreased need to transport glass slides, so the reduced cost from transportation, courier costs, avoiding lost or broken slides, and improved turnaround times for consultations because you're avoiding the transfer. Which is not to say that when I say reduced cost, there's the cost of the couriers, but of course there is the cost of implementing the system. So we'll discuss that in more detail as we go. And then finally, what Digital Path enables is artificial intelligence, computational pathology, and things that a human and a microscope cannot do. So we'll go on. Oh, just need to advance. Here we are. So here's an example I think that underscores things quite nicely. Any of you who have been involved in receiving consultations as glass slides will have experienced this phenomenon where you end up, hopefully you're able to reconstruct a jigsaw puzzle and review these slides. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen and slides are significantly damaged, it can be catastrophic. So historical barriers to adoption. At the institution level, we've got cost and disruption to traditional workflows. Pathologists don't, I've heard this over the course of my career. It's not my microscope. It's unproven. It slows me down. It will threaten my job. What's the point? There were comments about no guidelines, no best practice recommendations, lack of regulatory approval, Health Canada, FDA, CE mark, etc., and medical legal concerns. I think most of these things, though this was a slide that I first started using back in 2008, most of these issues have been addressed, but but the one that remains to a large extent is cost and disruption to traditional workflows, but particularly cost. And that was evidenced in a workshop that we had at Mackenzie Health in September of 2020, where there were some Greater Toronto Area hospitals that gathered just to kick around ideas on developing a digital pathology network. And the overriding sentiment at the end of the workshop was, no, this is a nice idea, but who's going to pay for it? And that is, I think, is the major concern that people have now. The digital path landscape in Canada post-pandemic, and I say 2022 to present, I think it goes without saying that a major rethink occurred on digital pathology during the COVID pandemic and as we emerged from it. Labs around the world have successfully gone digital, and in many ways, Canada is lagging behind. Mackenzie Health successfully transitioned to digital reporting for AP anatomical pathology in 2021, and we're one of a handful of institutions across the country that have successfully introduced it and have made that digital transition. And then I think it's important to look just beyond the four walls of the lab. This has been said by many who work in the digital pathology space. That the enabling functions of digital platforms provide benefits that go well beyond the laboratory, and that if we develop consultation networks where the right case goes to the right pathologist at the right time, and then we also enable the emerging tools in artificial intelligence and computational pathology, we've really started to leverage the full benefits that go beyond an individual lab. Evidence for interest in digital path across Canada. Just my own personal experience, since 2021, Mackenzie Health has hosted digital pathology visits from over 30 different hospitals in Ontario and across Canada. We hosted an Association for Pathology Informatics workshop, DPAI 8.0, had 180 attendees, including vendors and pathologists and bioinformaticians, representing over 50 institutions and vendor organizations, and all of them got a tour through the Mackenzie Digital Path implementation. And I think it's important to note that what we were able to show these visitors is what we did, which is a way to implement digital pathology, but it's not necessarily the way to do it. That each institution really has to take into account their own unique challenges and workflow requirements when going forward. So now we'll spring into my experience with some of these networks, and I'll try to move through this fairly quickly. This is from my time at University Health Network. between 2001 and 2020. So for those of you who are not familiar with UHN, it operates on a subspecialty pathology model and has multiple sites, particularly when I was there. These are all the subspecialty areas. And in order to try and provide subspecialty care across different sites, the question arose very early on, do we move slides, do we move pathologists, or do we look at digital path? And this started back in 2004. And so this is a slide that summarizes the digital pathology evolution at UHN through a series of niche adoptions. So it grew very organically, starting with the one application up on the top, which was frozen sections between Toronto Western and Toronto General. And I'll describe a few of the other projects and initiatives on this diagram. So our starting point in 2004 was, excuse me, neuropathology frozen sections, where at the Toronto Western site, we had upwards of 10 cases per week, range of 2 to 20 frozen sections. It was probably the most challenging application that we could have started with because it is a time-sensitive activity. Frozen section morphology is never as good as formalin or paraffin. You have a greater chance of having suboptimal samples, and it can be very stressful for pathologists. So why on earth would we have started with this? And the answer is here. We had full departmental consolidation at the Toronto General site, the Red Star on University Avenue. Into early 2006, there would be no regular on-site pathologist at the Toronto Western site, the Green Star on the left, to cover frozen sections originating from neurosurgical procedures. So again, move slides, move pathologists, or look at digital. And this was the initial initiative of Dr. Sylvia Asa, the program medical director at the time, was to implement this robotic microscope, which we did in 2004. After validating it, we went live. We used it for 2 years, covered 350 frozen sections. It worked extremely well, but it was slow. It would take roughly 10 minutes to review one slide, but it did work very well. Then we moved to whole slide imaging. That started in 2006 using an Apereo 5-slide scanner, a ScanScope CS. And from that time forward, we never looked back. There were over 6,000 frozen sections, the vast majority from neurosurgery, with discrepancy rates between final diagnosis and intraoperative impression that were bang on with traditional discordance rates when there were on-site pathologists looking at glass slides. So digital pathology did not introduce more erroneous interpretations. 14 to 16 minute turnaround time, which was in accordance for single block frozen sections in accordance with College of American Pathologists turnaround time criteria. And our deferral rate was less than 2%, where we had to tell a surgeon that we could only take a given specimen so far intraoperatively. And the quality point here is that at least 2 pathologists were able to review all deferrals. And this gave more confidence to the surgeon as well. Next one was Timmins. So this was Timmins and District Hospital. So a distance of 342 miles by air, 426 miles by road from downtown Toronto. It's a general community hospital. UHN assumed the medical leadership of the labs in Timmins and District Hospital in 2006. We did have there was one on-site pathologist who would rotate. There were 3 pathologists who took turns rotating, but 1 week per month there was no on-site pathologist, and this left a need to cover frozen sections that might have arisen in the absence of an on-site pathologist, or even providing consultation support for a single on-site pathologist when they were there. And so there's roughly 150 frozen sections per year involving tissue identification and intraoperative staging. The next one, Kingston General. So again, leveraging on our initial experience at the Toronto Western and with Timmins providing frozen section support over a distance, we established a partnership with Kingston General Hospital and to provide frozen section support for neuropathology frozen sections when the one neuropathologist on site was away on leave or unable to provide service for a given day. And so pathologists were given limited consulting privileges. We had full access to the electronic patient record, diagnostic imaging, and remote access to the lab information system. So it worked very well. And there's the distance there, 163 miles by road. Next one, Sioux area, 309 miles by air, 423 miles by road. And in this one, this is a large community hospital, and we provided support in terms of consultation for to the tune of roughly 15 to 20 cases per month in selected subspecialty areas where pathologists were willing to review digital consults. This was genitourinary pathology, derm, gynae, some gynae, GI pathology, and even some autopsy tissue sections as well. And the benefits from the Sioux area perspective, and I should underscore that the Sioux area pathology program at the time was included in the same lab information system, which was Cerner Copath. So it was fully integrated from that perspective. We were able to provide rapid access to subspecialty pathology opinion, importantly, providing some reassurance prior to sign out and identifying cases that really needed to be sent to UHN for more detailed immunohistochemistry workup or molecular workup that was not available in the Sioux area. So this basically was a way of triaging the types of cases that needed to be sent for full review. Again, creating efficient utilization of resources. We were also actually able to coordinate referral of patients to UHN oncologists in certain situations. Quality assurance, we were able to document it in the lab information system. As I said, it was fully integrated with the LIS at UHN. And this was also mentioned in a pathology report seen by clinicians and patients, again, for reassurance. And then finally, it was also an opportunity to provide some real-time continuing medical education when we discuss these cases. And here's one such example of how digital really saved having to send a whole case down. It was a 28-year-old female, had a left partial nephrectomy for an interesting kidney tumor that on imaging was solid and cystic. This was my differential diagnosis based on the radiology characteristics and the histology, and I felt very strongly it was going to turn out to be an eosinophilic solid and cystic renal cell carcinoma, quite rare. And there was one particular stain that they had not done, which was cytokeratin 20, and CK20 is extremely rare. Positivity is extremely rare in kidney tumors and is really only limited to eosinophilic solid and cystic renal cell carcinoma. And that was my final diagnosis. So I was able to sort this out for them with one particular stain and avoid having to send the entire case down. Next, we move on to Lakeridge Health, a distance of 40 miles from the downtown of Toronto. And we were involved in providing subspecialty coverage and helping Lakeridge Health at the time transition to a subspecialty reporting model. Once again, as with Timmins and with Sioux area projects, we had a common lab information system with whole slide imaging integration, and it was roughly 300 to 400 slides per day that were being sent to UHN at the time. And this was the architecture. Important to note here that the default scanning was actually done by office admin staff. The scanning was routinely performed at 20x, not 40x, as most scanners default to now. Fully integrated with Copath, as I mentioned. We had a secure network system that involved the UHN data center, and it worked quite well, but honestly, it was for a small scale project. Primary diagnoses, we went live in October of 2012, and between then and the time that the contract, the collaboration came to an end, just before I left UHN in 2020, we reported over 16,000 cases from select subspecialty areas. Looking at the dollars and cents of this, for shipping slides by courier. So we did undertake an analysis of how much it costs. So $35,000 per year for a daily courier run that left at 1 p.m., meaning the lab was pressured to get slides ready for send out by 1 p.m. And of course, if you go digital, there's no time cutoff. Then there were $14,500 spent on ad hoc couriers for rush cases so that follow-up appointments could be kept as scheduled. And we had $28,000 in clerical staff costs for packing and scanning in and scanning out slides. Interestingly enough, it was pointed out that Lakeridge was spending $1,000 a month on slide folders that left Lakeridge Health and never returned. So this left a total of $78,500 at a minimum to send 300 to 400 slides per day from Oshawa to downtown Toronto. So looking at this and at the cost of a particular scanner, et cetera, that you really could recoup scanning and imaging archiving costs in 2 to 3 years by not having to ship all the glass slides. And it really didn't make sense to ship glass slides when we had digital pathology as a validated alternative at the time. There were also some intangible costs associated with shipping slides that people don't necessarily think about. Staff contacting pathologists about the timing of couriers. So this is phone calls, and it's pulling people away from what they would regularly do to make special phone calls. The need for rush delivery and ad hoc couriers. Cost to patient care of delayed delivery for critical cases due to downtown Toronto traffic issues, and this happened. So I'm not sure how you assign a cost to that. Delays in accessioning of consultation cases sent out. Clerical staff have to give, a primary diagnosis cases their first priority. So there were delays in turnaround time for consultation and path reviews that were sent to UHN. Glass slides became lost or misplaced in pathologists' offices. That entailed time spent looking by pathologists, by clerical staff, admin assistants, et cetera, searching for slides. Who has the slides? Especially if and this was especially an issue if glass slides were required for a second opinion at another institution and they couldn't be found. So if we look overall at the satisfaction of this particular project from a workflow perspective, you consider pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic. The pre-analytic side, the lab and admin staff at Lakeridge Health liked it. They found it faster, cheaper, easier to do. There were smiles. Post-analytically, the clinic staff at Lakeridge were also very happy. Follow-up appointments were kept as scheduled. If we looked at the pathologists that were involved, it was a mixed bag of opinions. Some said it worked for me, recognizing also, to be fair, that the technology was new at the time. Some said it worked for them. Others said it slows me down, it disrupts my schedule. What's in it for me? So these are some of the things that you need to expect when you introduce digital into your diagnostic environment. And it also highlights the issue of a hybrid glass workflow, hybrid glass slide, digital slide workflow. There's a significant culture change that's involved here, and you need to learn to work from electronic work lists as opposed to reacting to physical slides that arrive in piles in cardboard trays. So there is a potential when you're working between glass and digital to forget about digitized cases that are in your work list. And what I frequently heard was, it's just easier for me if I get the slides by courier. So you really have to break free of that hybrid workflow in order to complete full adoption. Let's go to network project number 2, which was the multi-jurisdictional telepathology project involving Canada Health Infoway. The MJT, some high-level project goals, and this got going in 2010. Was to develop a scalable, sustainable national telepathology network strategy. And there would be symmetrical leadership structures within each participating province or territory, provincial hubs based in academic centers with spokes to regional hospitals, and then inter-provincial communication between the hubs. Enable consultation between pathologists to enhance subspecialty service. And the idea was to start with 3 jurisdictions Ontario, which was essentially a University Health Network, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Manitoba. And then the idea would be to add on other provinces as we move forward. So this was the original map of the participants in the project. We had a funding model. So there was a development period between October 2010 and March 2011. Importantly, each jurisdiction was responsible for its own local implementation. So Canada Health Infoway was not cutting checks to participating hospitals to buy scanners, etc. It was the overarching connectivity that was the key. UHN served as the transfer payment agent, which was essentially managing procurement and implementation of connectivity software and technical infrastructure for the project. Canada Health Infoway funded the connectivity and technical infrastructure, again, not providing checks to hospitals to buy scanners. This was to the tune of 75% of the MJT project cost, and then the transfer payment agent, i.e. UHN, was reimbursed based on meeting timelines and key deliverables. So the MJT assumptions. First off, that the project was to be completed in 30 months. And I put that in red font because in retrospect, this was way too ambitious. And I'll elaborate why. All jurisdictions must connect to the MJT solution. Adoption targets would be set locally for the overall MJT, and complete funding for adoption from CHI would not be provided until the entire implementation was complete. So there were some key dependencies. Ontario, I think, it's fair to say we had at UHN 6 years of lead time experience in digital path. So we took a lot of things for granted in terms of navigating some of the early pain points. They were in the rearview mirror for us, and we were well out in front of the other sites. So there was recognizing these other jurisdictions were essentially starting from scratch. There was a disparity in digital pathology experience, which I think did impact how the project rolled forward. Local implementations in Manitoba, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Ontario. There were local project charters, statements of work, budgets, procurement processes, RFPs. These were all part of the, as I mentioned, the local implementations. MJT timelines were dependent on the local timeline. So the project could only move forward as fast as the slowest participant. The local hub and spoke solutions had to be completed before designing the overarching MJT solution. Then next we move on to privacy and security. So things you can't take for granted here. You need privacy impact threat risk assessments, privacy training for all users, patient privacy, use of PHI, jurisdictional policy differences between the participating provinces, and also privacy requirements that don't necessarily align between institutions, consent management for secondary use of cases, teaching, research, etc. All of this needed to be sorted out, passwords, multi-factor authentication, of course, monitoring for privacy breaches and incident management when it happened, and trying to develop common workflow protocols that met the requirements of each jurisdiction. Again, is something that's easier said than done. The list of problems now. So I think first off, with regard to the transfer payment agent contract, the Ontario Telepathology expansion project at UHN existed as a separate project, which did create some confusion within the MJT. So again, speaking to some of the problems that arise when you have one group that's much further ahead than others when you're trying to build a network. Jurisdictional contracts with multiple vendors. There were over 12 separate agreements. And importantly, one key vendor went out of business during the implementation process. So there are problems now with ensuring positive patient identification, and this speaks to the issue of interoperability. So certain scanning platforms would not speak well with one another, and there were problems with seeing even something as simple as slide labels, which became an obvious risk. Funding, reimbursement, and budgeting, as I described before, was highly dependent on these scheduling dependencies that I described in the previous slides. Adoption targets, staying on course for those with validation numbers of trained users, and then actually exchanging consult cases. We started to fall off because of some of the challenges that I mentioned up above. Documents and communication between committees. We didn't really have consistent central storage of documents between the two jurisdictions, and this resulted in some action items being missed. So this is something going forward. When this is done again, you need to pay particular attention to this. Privacy and security, as I mentioned before earlier. So this is my view on why this MJT project ultimately failed to launch in the way that we had hoped. First, I think it was too ambitious for the time. The projected timelines were not realistic given disparity in experience between digital pathology or between the jurisdictions who are participating in the project. At the end of the day, I think we did have a bit of a lack of coordinated oversight and communication. Failure to identify and manage interdependencies between jurisdictions. And as I mentioned before, this project could only move as fast as the slowest partner in the project. So if one jurisdiction's timelines slipped, the entire project was delayed. Another key one is a lack of integration with lab information systems that created some cumbersome and potentially risky workflows. So you can go on. That's what I'm going to say about the MJT project from my perspective. You're able to find two documents that are available through Canada Health Infoway, and you can read objectively for yourselves and form your own opinions based on what I presented here and what you would read in those documents. Next one, move on to Mackenzie Health and Digital Pathology, the Digital Pathology Network of Ontario project with the Mount Sinai group. So Mackenzie Health, I'll just start a little bit on the local implementation there. It's a two-site community hospital in Vaughan and Richmond Hill in the north of Toronto, serving a very large catchment area of over 500,000 people. Two sites, Mackenzie Richmond Hill Hospital and the new Cortellucci Vaughan Hospital, which opened in February 2021. The case for going digital at Mackenzie Health, I think it's a unique situation in that as opposed to approaching this from a return on investment perspective, where you look at the cost to implement, how much revenue you might generate, how much money you might save, and looking for a return on investment in 3 to 5 years. And if you just take this very narrow focus within the four walls of a lab, this particular return on investment strategy is going to fail as a business case in most institutions. You come to the conclusion there is no business case, it's just more cost. Whereas the leadership at Mackenzie Health, commensurate with building a brand new hospital, decided on a strategic investment for lab medicine. So adopting the mindset that digital pathology is the new paradigm, it's required for contemporary practice, and it's an essential platform for incorporating AI machine learning into routine practice. So this was really a corporate decision from senior leadership to transition over 2 to 3 years. $4 to $5 million total in commitment was made to pathology and lab medicine for a variety of intended goals that I mentioned earlier. And statement from the CEO of our hospital when I was during the recruitment process when I was joining. He said that digital pathology is a tool required for practice going forward, and by analogy, there's no business case for an MRI scanner in a hospital. And so that was the unique position that Mackenzie Health has taken. The entire implementation journey took 3 years. These are our office workstations, and you'll see by the red arrow, there's still a microscope there. So we do use it, but the vast majority of our surgical pathology work, well over 98% of it, is done without glass slides. We also have, excuse me, we also have home workstations, which turned out, I think, to be our biggest adoption driver. And so the hospital issued and supported the workstations, could be done for $3,000 per workstation. And that really, once we got those validated and verified, there were no naysayers to digital pathology at Mackenzie Health. This is our system. So we have Philips scanners integrated with Epic AP Beaker. And this is the slide I show quite frequently about what full adoption looks like. So prior to full adoption, glass slides were dropped in pathologists' boxes. And then this is what it looks like now. The only slides that come in through there now would be cytology, wet hematopathology, consults cases that come from outside of Mackenzie Health, or cases where there were image quality problems and pathologists needed glass slides to review. We developed our own on-site backed up storage system, which I won't go into in great detail, but it has a 10-year capacity and doesn't involve clouds, at least at this point. And the reason for doing that, we found it was much cheaper than cloud, less than half the cost, especially as the archive grew. It was faster retrieval with fewer firewalls and network switches. Mackenzie Health already pays for monitoring mission critical IT systems. This is 24/7. And it was also scalable with retained performance out into the petabyte range with a predictable cost. So for us, at the volume of slides that we generate, this was the better alternative, which is not to say it couldn't change going forward. Now we move to the collaboration that we had with Mount Sinai Hospital. So this was 2 years of funding given as a result through the Ontario Health Tests of Change program. And the idea was to establish a proof of concept for a point-to-point connection, sharing slides through a third-party connectivity solutions with a scanner-agnostic viewer. And so here's one example of a case that was sent from Mount Sinai to Mackenzie Health. Absolutely fine, clear cell renal cell carcinoma, core biopsy, no issue. We were able to validate it. Going through a series of cases in GU pathology, GI pathology, and soft tissue involving 3 pathologists in those key areas. So we were able to validate it technically, but we did run into some challenges, such as finalizing agreements. So you get into the issues where you have 2 sets of lawyers and red line documents that go back and forth. There were particularly issues on alignment with privacy requirements between the hospitals. So again, something similar to what arose within the MJT. And then there were the issues of technical issues where there was some initial digital slide incompatibility. And that's shown here. So this is with the iSyntax format that we have for with the Philips platform. When we uploaded to the third-party platform, to share with colleagues at Mount Sinai, we noticed there were these large white patches where whole areas of pixels just didn't cross an interface. And this required a major software rewrite on the part of the third-party solution provider. So again, this really speaks to the need for interoperability and checking these things very carefully as you go and looking for these problems, which really can sideline an entire project or delay it significantly. So that's a nice segue into the concept of interoperability, which really we're just talking about the ability of different whole slide imaging platforms, at least in terms of digital pathology, to communicate and exchange information and data. And so the problem now is we have a number of proprietary file formats. So you've got SVS, RTS, iSyntax, MRXS, etc. So a number of different vendors with a number of proprietary formats. And importantly, whole slide imaging files have more than just pixels. They're more than just pictures. There's annotations, there's metadata, all buried in those files. And all of that needs to be shared if you're going to move forward into a network situation. Scanner agnostic interface solutions are definitely exist for sharing pixels, but we have to make sure that the metadata and all of the other information that I mentioned is accessible when you share. And this can be, interoperability and maintainability can become a significant barrier if labs become siloed with respect to vendors and then create significant workflow bottlenecks. So I think the solution here would be the DICOM standard. And I'm sure many on this call, if not everyone, would be familiar with it already. It's not specifically a file format. It's just a set of rules. It's a wrapper global standard for communication and management of any medical image. And so data standardization in digital pathology is really necessary for full clinical integration, for file sharing between pathologists in different institutions, and consultation, development of consultation networks. All of this really requires seamless integration. Particularly if you're going to layer on computational pathology and AI tools, and you're going to do it irrespective of proprietary file formats. So that's where DICOM comes in. And in terms of the history, started back in radiology, 1985. The person I always think of when I hear of DICOM is Dr. David Clooney, and that things were well established in the radiology space into the 1990s. And 2005 was when work began to support an anatomic pathology and whole slide imaging DICOM standard. And so in 2005, it began as Working Group 26, which was established to extend the DICOM standard to whole slide imaging. 2010, there was Supplement 145, where there were digital pathology applications that were incorporated into the DICOM standard. And then by 2017, the Digital Pathology Association Visions annual meeting and other digital pathology congresses around the world began hosting DICOM Connectathons, which was working towards demonstrating plug-and-play systems for pathology labs, encouraging vendors to engage in standard development and technical. And I think it's really important here to underscore, while it is possible for labs to quote unquote do DICOM, I think it really behooves vendors to configure their file formats to meet the DICOM specifications. And this is basically, the issue for digital pathology. So these are pyramidal images where the base of the pyramid is the highest resolution captured by the scanner, and the higher layers going up are for lower power, and they're derived through successive downsampling. And DICOM provides these rules for storing each layer as a separate data set or instance, along with metadata annotations, and providing specified protocols for reporting, compression, and image presentation. So this is really something that needs to be done to implement a network effectively, to share complete information with digital path images. And with that, I'll just finish with my take-home messages here. So I think hopefully I have left you with the impression that establishing these networks, it takes time, energy, and patience. One should not underestimate the work that's involved. There really aren't any shortcuts here. You have to accept a certain degree of risk and expect the unexpected during the implementation process. And as I've said before, it's my personal opinion, there's no uniform template for a local implementation. It is important for places that have implemented digital pathology, I think, to make their departments open so that others who are early on in the planning process or the implementation journey can come and see what they've done, and sharing of ideas, et cetera, is really essential. In terms of the network projects that I mentioned, Network One, the UHN partnerships, I think that illustrated the importance of taking a needs-driven organic growth approach. So starting with a series of niche adoptions does work well. You can start by learning lessons with easy, very focused applications, and it makes it easier to add on new use cases. We also did illustrate these partnerships did illustrate the importance of LIS integration. For the MJT, I think my bottom line take-home message is avoid trying to boil the ocean, especially when you're working with groups where there's a disparity in digital pathology experience across the group. Expectations need to be managed very carefully there in terms of implementation timelines and goals. Network 3 for Ontario, I think now we are positioned for success based on a change in mindset of implementing digital pathology, and a significant number of groups across the province that have either gone through an RFP process and have actually procured and implemented and are at various stages of validating and transitioning toward full digital reporting. I think we're nicely positioned now to move this forward. It's early days and my fingers are crossed. And I think ultimately the way forward here, we really need to focus on standards to achieve interoperability. And with that, I will stop with a picture that I think really makes us very proud as Canadians. Um, the sniper shot from Connor McDavid last night. I think Canada, the nation's feeling pretty good about itself, and I think we should also feel pretty good about the prospects for Digital Path. And with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate this, Dr. Evans. This was a terrific. You can see in the chat there's a really great reactions here. I'd like to maybe just start by there's some questions around DICOM, and that's very much kind of where I'd like to
Yeah.
take this. There's a question about are you using DICOM at Mackenzie and about the adoption of scanners. And the other, I'll let you comment on that, and I'll also piggyback my own question on here, where I'm curious about um, how many of your colleagues are even aware of DICOM that you speak to? Because you seem
Yeah.
like a unicorn of the pathologists that I speak to.
Yeah.
Many it's not on their radar.
For sure. So first things first, no, the digital file formats that we use at Mackenzie are related to Philips, and that's all iSyntax. So there's no DICOM there. There are actually only a couple of scanners that I'm aware of that will natively output in DICOM format, and then they'll immediately flip to proprietary format. And there are some reasons for that. Um, so I think it really behooves us as a pathologist community to really push the vendors. And this can be done through like these connectathons, et cetera, the DPA visions, where the vendors are invited, and perhaps maybe there can be a little bit of shaming that's involved for those that don't participate. But to make sure that their formats, their file formats, can be configured in such a way that the DICOM rules are adopted. I think another challenge with DICOM is the fact that there are versions. I think we're currently on, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, I think we're on version 3 now for
Correct.
the pathology standard. And so versions 3, 2, and 1, to the best of my understanding, don't necessarily play nicely together. So we could be creating some more issues there. And then finally, in terms of awareness of DICOM, I couldn't agree more. Um, that I know that for the Association for Pathology Informatics workshop that we had at Mackenzie Health, this was feedback that came from some is we needed some discussion on DICOM. And so I think API is going to take that forward in the next workshop next September or October, whenever they host it. Will definitely feature a session all about DICOM, everything you wanted to know about it. I think, there are some misconceptions. I've had some pathologists mention to me that they have the idea that if you're not using DICOM, you're not using you won't be achieving the best image quality, and it doesn't have anything to do with that. The pixels are the pixels, so it doesn't guarantee pristine images, but it allows for sharing.
And sometimes you hear that where it's versioning, but maybe everyone's using DICOM 3, but it's really just a matter of the vendor, all standards have a degree of fluidity to them. So it's how you're interpreting what one is supposed to do versus the other. And I'm curious as well, so as you're going down the path of perhaps, purchasing a new system or,
Mhm.
working on regional efforts, how much is this coming into a play as far as establishing the need for DICOM? Is that
Yeah.
a requirement?
Well, I would think that the logical way to build that in is as groups go through requests for information, requests for proposals, et cetera, that they build those in there as checklist items. Like, is your solution DICOM? Does it conform to DICOM standards?
And
Uh,
yeah, Gord has a great comment in here. It really reminds me of the old radiology days where you're going to want a vendor that's going to give you a viewer specific to one CT scanner. Alan had a great question in here about
mhm.
the uh, related to the color. And so, is there a specific color calibration that needs to be done on the displays for pathology?
There are recommendations for doing it. I mean, it's a very interesting question. The whole issue of displays could actually be a completely different 1 to 2 hour talk. Um, so I think the bottom line is, in terms of using displays for diagnostic work, it's been the College of American Pathologists' position is you can use what you can validate. And then there's a lot of discussion, particularly on labs that are getting, in early on in the implementation or discernment process about so-called medical grade monitors, medical grade displays that can be thousands and thousands of dollars. And so at Mackenzie, the office workstations that we have do have such a display. The monitor was worth $12,000 a piece. They've since come down. Some of the newer versions are a bit cheaper, but not much. But for our home workstations, we were able to quite comfortably validate a $500 to $600 off-the-shelf monitor. And that's what we've done. And we validated it against the expensive medical grade display. Now, the medical grade display has inbuilt color calibration. So every time you turn it on, it's constantly calibrating, checking, calibrating, and checking. So what we do for the home workstations is we do periodic calibration checks. And there are a variety of ways that you can do that. Then, aside from that, going just to on a more superficial level with color, there actually is a small digital pathology literature on grayscaling images and whether or not it impacts the diagnosis, the ability of a pathologist to make a diagnosis. And for the vast majority of surgical pathology activities, particularly diagnosing malignancies, it doesn't matter. You can do it effectively on grayscaled images. Where it does come into play, obviously, is interpretation of special stains, which are all based on color. So um, microorganisms, tissue elements, issues that come to mind like Hale's colloidal iron, iron staining, copper staining, immunohistochemical stains, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where the color calibration really comes in. So it is important. And it's yet another issue that is evolving as more and more labs implement digital pathology. Those standards will I think, start to become crystallized.
So I'll jump back. There was a question that Stephen Harold from Sectra had put in early at the beginning.
Mhm.
You had mentioned around standardizing the protocols, and you saw that was a bit more challenge than you were expecting. How much variance did you see across the different workflow protocols from one organization to another?
I mean, it can be quite variable. So it just depends on, when you look at generally when you're going to implement digital path, it's been my experience, what works best is to really have a good solid understanding and actually even sit down and draw a process map of your glass slide workflow as it exists, and then insert a digital pathology device into the mix and see how that workflow changes. And that's why I make the comment about there's really no one size fits all template. That different labs have different ways of handling their workflow, et cetera, and that just simply trying to drop a scanner into the mix the way another institution has done it can create some significant disruptions to the point where they can be basically showstoppers. Um, so I think it's really important to understand your basic workflow, and then how it will change when you implement a digital pathology device.
Something that has always been looked at in radiology, never taken significantly too far, is the opportunity of lossy compression. Alan's asking around lossy compression for digital path, and I guess you'd be losing specific artifacts here. Has
Mhm.
that been investigated much?
There is a literature on it. And that, people have done studies, for example, in terms of compression where, what's the term? I've never been directly involved with the research, but it's like least noticeable difference. So you just compress a series of images, and then you show them to pathologists, and then you get them to go down the scale and say, aha, there's something different about this one. And so there is a literature on that as well. I think I take the opportunity to go down a bit of a different road in answering this question is that there aren't any standards for what has to be retained. So for diagnostic images used for diagnostic care, recognizing we have the glass slides, which are, the basically are the part of the patient record, and that we're using digital pathology as we use a microscope as a tool to review that glass slide. And so, of course, obviously, there are some differences between glass and digitized workflows. Um, but I think the key question that arises is, do we have to retain everything? How should we retain it, and for how long should we retain it? And so these are issues that at least I can speak from my experience on the College of American Pathologists. There are different committees that are working on the idea of an evidence-based guideline to determine what to retain, how to retain it, and for how long. And then setting up, I think you can do this in an evidence-based way, so that certain things that you just simply go and interrogate your own archive for glass slides. And how often do you pull these types of cases, certain types of cases out for re-review? And probably a large proportion of them, you never pull them out. And so for those types of cases, you could develop a graded strategy for deleting those from your archive, even auto deleting them. And then some that you're much more likely to go back to, cancer cases, etc. Um, um, or slides that have biomarker information on them where interpretations were made completely from digital, plus or minus AI. Those are the ones I think that you may want to keep for longer. But I think as a community of practice, pathologists will decide on the best way forward, and the most risk-averse way to deal with that. And that could ultimately deal with some of these concerns about lossiness of images. If you're putting fewer mundane things, unnecessary things into your archive, and you're saving the more important things, then maybe you can the ones that you are saving, you don't have to compress to the same degree.
Well, thank you very much. There's more questions. Maybe what I can do is I can compile any ones that we missed and I can send them over to you and I can post them in the forum for the group to see. And then really appreciate this. For everyone that's still on the line, this is just a plug for in April, we have a medical imaging informatics and teleradiology conference in Hamilton. You're automatically entered as a free registrant, no travel included, but by attending today. And I encourage you to also attend next month, where we have David Kwan, and he'll be talking about the results of the IHE North American Connectathon that just took place in Toronto the other week. But again, Dr. Evans, thank you very much. Really appreciate this,
Oh,
and we
thank
hope
you.
to do it again.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation. I hope it was useful. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Okay,
Bye bye.
bye-bye.